Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
I'm Emily Woodbury. "120 years ago, ragtime composer and musician Scott Joplin lived in St. Louis at 2658 A. Morgan Street. During that time, some of his most famous works were published, like this rag. The Entertainer, written by Scott Joplin in 1902 in St. Louis. That was one of many songs Joplin composed during the few years he spent in the Gateway City. And here with me now to share more about Joplin's work, his life, and his time here in St. Louis is Cookie Jordan. She's the site administrator for the Scott Joplin House. That site is where Joplin lived from approximately 1900 to 1902. Cookie, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you.
So Joplin was here during the height of ragtime's popularity. What do we know about what brought him to St. Louis?
Well, Scott Joplin was born in Texas, so he came to Missouri through Sedalia, Missouri. He attended George R. Smith School for Negroes at the time, and worked in and studied music there, and wrote the Maple Leaf Rag, which became over 1 million copies sold in sheet music. So he thought that he would do great coming to St. Louis with the World's Fair coming. And so he had appeared at the World's Fair in Chicago, so he thought that it would be a bigger push for the ragtime music and the style of music that he was publishing and having published and writing. And so I think that was the push to come to St. Louis.
So I've heard that Joplin was pretty unique because he knew how to write and read music. He was a composer in addition to being a musician. What do we know about where he learned to play, kind of his musical background?
Well, he was, as a child, he learned to play just by fiddling with the piano. He was very musical, learned how to play the banjo by his mother. His brothers and sisters were very musical, but his mother supposedly worked, she was a washerwoman, and so that meant she worked at different people's homes, and some of the homes had pianos. So Scott Joplin could play without knowledge of reading music at the time, but he ended up with a music coach, teacher, Alfred Weiss, and that's how he got his start, and really enthusiastic start. A wonderful teacher, a German man who was a teacher for. At the time, Texas didn't have public schools, so you had to hire your own teacher, and so the rich were able to hire people that from other countries to come and teach their children. So on the side, he would teach Scott Joplin.
Wow, interesting. Now, he's often referred to now as the king of ragtime, and you mentioned, millions of copies sold. But was he famous at the time he performed? Was he very well known at the turn of the century?
He was pretty well known. Because of the Maple Leaf Rag, because of the styles of music that he wrote, because he wrote other things besides rags. He wrote waltzes and marches and a couple of ballets and a couple of operas. So he was getting to be well known.
And a couple of operas. I don't know if a lot of people know that Scott Joplin wrote opera.
Yes, he wrote 2 operas. The first is lost, and we don't know where it is, but we have evidence that he wrote it. That was called Guest of Honor, and that was to recognize that Booker T. Washington had been a guest of honor in Roosevelt's White House and had gone to a state dinner. Actually, it was a state luncheon, but he was an African-American man that was very prominent, probably the most well-known African-American man besides Frederick Douglass, and he had a meal at the White House. So that was really big news across the whole United States at the time that it happened. And because Booker T. Washington was such a proponent of education, you'll notice there's Booker T. Washington schools in almost every state of the Union that are usually dedicated to teaching African-American children. But Booker T. Washington also was for people learning and going on to college. So he wrote that in reference to Booker T. being a visitor to Roosevelt's White House. He also wrote a piece for Roosevelt called The Strenuous Life, which was based off of the book that Roosevelt had written called The Strenuous Life as well.
So the house Joplin lived in St. Louis, where you work today, Cookie, and it's now Delmar Boulevard. It used to be A. Morgan Street. It's situated right at the confluence of Midtown, Downtown, and Jeff Vanderloo neighborhoods. What do we know about what the neighborhood was like when Joplin lived there?
It was a very diverse neighborhood. It was African-American, Irish, and Jewish. Irish and German. Not so much German Jews, but it was a German neighborhood. Probably Lutheran, some Catholics, and it was a mixed neighborhood when Scott Joplin was there. A lot of the German rich had moved out, and the Irish poor and African American neighbors had moved in by that time. It was a teeming, crowded neighborhood. It was very musical. Besides Scott Joplin, William Blue lived in the neighborhood. Louis Chavon's brother Sylvester lived in the neighborhood, and Louis Chavon was also a ragtime writer, and he composed, but he could not write the music. So Scott Joplin helped him with a piece called Heliotrope Bouquet, and William Blue was a band leader and eventually wrote in a journal that the History Museum has. When he was in World War II, he was a band leader in like the USO troops or the troops that travel and play music. They did that to cheer on the soldiers. So he was in a group of African American musicians that traveled throughout France, cheering on he was also a soldier, but that was his job as a soldier, was to be a musician. So he lived on the site actually where we are at 2650 Delmar on the rear, and Sylvester Chavon lived at 2650 in the front of Morgan Street, which is now Delmar. So it was quite a musical neighborhood, quite lively and vibrant and very busy.
And how do you piece this together, all of this history? You know, like you mentioned that the opera Guest of Honor existed, but that it's lost. You know, I feel like this is 120 years ago. These are some like ancient documents. How are you piecing together all of this history?
It's very interesting work, and it's very tedious work. And when I first started there, we really didn't know a whole lot about Scott Joplin. We knew the basic story from Blythe and Janice's work, but newspapers.com and ancestry.com has just opened up a lot of information for everyone in the history field that they can research. So the newspapers of the day might have little information about someone coming to town, like Dunbar or Lawrence Dunbar, the poet, or they might have an ad for Scott Joplin playing at a musical in the newspaper. So just reading newspapers, old newspapers, is what we do a lot of at the Scott Joplin House. So, and then we have to check. Just like with nowadays, you have to check the different views because the different newspapers might cover a story differently. If it's a story, a lot of times you have to make sure that the views are that we're telling this true story. Because
do you have an example of that?
Sometimes the coverage of something that happened could be swayed by the writer of the story. So the Globe Democrat might be given a different view of the story versus the Post-Dispatch. And so, and Globe Democrat, of course, was a newspaper here in St. Louis. And the different stories, sometimes the gossip columns is where you get a lot of information, but it may have a kernel of truth in it versus the actual what happened. An example is if someone died or was murdered or something, you could check the obituaries, and usually the obituary will tell you when they died or how they died sometimes. With some of the stories, you get two different sides, so you have to decide, well, which one is the truth? And so where they correspond, that's where you try to go from there. And it's a lot of detective work. You have to read more than one entry to decipher what actually took place. It's like writing a detective story backwards. It's it's interesting work.
I'm talking now about Scott Joplin with Cookie Jordan. She's the site administrator for the Scott Joplin House in St. Louis. I'd like to have us listen to another Joplin classic. Here is The Cascades. So, Cookie, I read that Joplin was inspired to compose this piece for the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and you mentioned that at the start of our conversation. Tell me a little bit about his inspiration for that and his connection to the fair.
Well, as I mentioned, he did come to St. Louis because of the fair. A lot of people came to St. Louis to get work with the fair or to work the grounds or to start businesses or just to be where the World's Fair was going to take place. A World's Fair was someplace that everyone wanted to be, not just the fairgoers, but it's a World's Fair. We don't have them anymore, but World's Fair would bring people from all over the world. So everyone wanted to be here, and they needed workers to work the World's Fair. And then people wanted to be the entertainers at the World's Fair. And even though Scott Joplin was not an entertainer per se at the World's Fair, he did write this piece, and a lot of people wrote pieces especially for the World's Fair. And the Cascades represents the cascading waterfalls that were at the World's Fair. So the sound of the trickling sounds like the trickling water from the cascading waterfall that was in front of the art museum, today's art museum, and so the Art Palace. And so he was inspired by whatever was going on around him. He really was very in tune to what was going on in the country and going on in nature and going on in the environment. Several of his pieces are works that represent flowers and trees, and even his other opera, which I didn't mention, which was Tremonisha, is named for a little girl that was found under a tree and was adopted. So her name became Tremonisha. Monisha was the adoptive mother's name, so they gave her that name. But because she was so soothed by the tree, he named it Tremonisha. And this coming year, Opera Theater St. Louis will be presenting a new work, including Tremonisha within its body, but a prologue and epilogue will be added to Scott Joplin's original work that talks about him and his wife, Freddie Alexander, on both ends in the prologue and the epilogue. That gives it a look into Scott Joplin's life from the point of view of his writing this work. So we're so looking forward to Opera St. Louis doing this incredible piece.
Really looking forward to that. And you said when around can we?
It'll be this summer. So it will be when they have their season. So it's not how opera theater works. It's not every night is an opera. The opera singers have to rest their voices, so they will have whatever 4 operas that they're presenting. And I don't have all 4 of them with me. I just know Tremonisha, but I know all 4 of them, but I don't want to mess up. But one night will be Scott Tremonisha, and then the other night will be the other piece. And so they'll have they run concurrently, intermingled throughout the entire month.
Now, I wonder if Joplin's identity as a Black man living in the early 20th century presents challenges to learning about him today. You know, we talked about kind of how you're digging into documents and trying to find all this information. Is that something you encounter? And as kind of technology gets more robust, do you hope to learn even more about him in the future?
We hope to learn more. We always hope to learn more. Like I said, we used to say, I can't answer that, and sometimes we can't. But the one good thing about Missouri is they documented everything. So if you got married here, there's a document. Now, sometimes the courthouse burnt down and those documents left, but most of the documents in St. Louis are intact. The ones that were in Sedalia were lost due to a fire. But Missouri was very integral in collecting every piece of information they could on people. So and it's very extraordinary that we had that foresight to do that. A lot of states did not.
For instance, he doesn't have a birth certificate, right?
Right. He does not have a birth certificate. He was born in Texas, but we do know his death date because he died in New York. And they were very savvy about collecting information as well. But some of the states were not as actively collecting information, vital statistics.
Now, Cookie, we started this conversation by mentioning how the Scott Joplin House in St. Louis made news after someone broke into the building in October, damaged tens of thousands of dollars in furniture and artifacts. The damage is pretty significant. Can you share with us a bit of what happened in our final few minutes here and what needs to happen for the site to reopen?
Well, we're currently closed. We will reopen we're hoping to open in February when we typically open. So during that time, we will we are assessing all the damages. We had to do a total inventory of artifacts and furniture and all of those things, and make sure that everything is still there. We're still doing that, but we have found and cataloged and recatalogued 1,271 pieces, but that includes sheet music and piano rolls and furniture and objects of art, those types of things, because we have to make sure that everything is accounted for, and the pieces that aren't, then we'll be able to tell the story. And some of the things we were going to deaccession because they really had no link, and we weren't going to go that way in education. For instance, if someone gave us, we get donations a lot of piano rolls. Sometimes people give us their whole collection, and so once we take a gift, we have to account for it. We just can't say, well, we don't need this and you can have it, or you can take this home, or we can throw it away. No, we don't do that. We have to hold on to it. So we try to be very careful of what we take in as a donation. And then with the damages that were done, not knowing what was thrown out the window, what was broken, totally, if something was totally smashed or totally torn up or something, because it was that type of damage, we have to figure out, well, that one is missing, and maybe that was a piece that occurred on October 1st. So it's like piecing together a puzzle. We're actively working on it. We have sent banjos out to be repaired, and we're working towards that end to bring everything together. And I think we'll make our February opening, and so for a bigger and better Scott Joplin House.
Well, I look forward to visiting then, Cookie. Good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you.
Cookie Jordan is the site administrator for the Scott Joplin House in St. Louis, where Scott Joplin lived from 1900 to 1902. St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Emily Woodbury.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our production intern is Avery Rogers.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.